A man kneels alone in the dark. A frozen lake stretches behind him under the iron sky of a Wisconsin February. The cedar siding of a building no one has touched in 63 years rises out of the snow. The loading doors are open just 3 feet wide. Inside, the cold is older than the weather. The cold has been waiting. His granddaughter is not yet born when he hides what he hides. She will not find it until she is 21, until she has lost everything, until she has $10 in her pocket and nowhere to sleep. A small iron pick, a trembling hand, 3 planks of pine whose grain runs at a slightly different angle than the wall around them. She presses upward. The panel gives. Behind it, in a cavity packed with sawdust and lined with waxed canvas, something has been waiting in the dark for a granddaughter who has not yet been born. Her hand reaches in. The man was 33 years old, and he was standing on the loading ramp of a commercial ice house on the north shore of Butternut Lake in Vilas County, Wisconsin. On the afternoon of March 8th, 1961, and the temperature was 12 degrees below zero, and the wind was coming down off the lake from the northwest, and his name was Gus Whitaker, and he was about to do something he had never done before in his life. He was about to lock the doors and walk away. The iron key was heavy in his bare hand. He had taken his glove off to feel the weight of it. A man who has spent 15 winters on the surface of a frozen lake learns to do certain things bare-handed. The cold did not bother him. The cold had never bothered him. His father, Niels, had told him when he was 18 years old that the cold was not the enemy of a working man. The cold was the working man's truth. The cold told you whether you were strong enough for the day or not. Gus Whitaker had been strong enough for 15,000 days. He looked up at the loading doors. They were tall doors, 12 feet high, white oak hand-planed fitted with iron hardware forged in Eagle River in 1898. The doors had been opened and closed by the men of his family, and the men of the Lindgren family, and the men of the Matson family, and the men of the Bjork family for 63 winters in a row. 342 blocks of ice had gone through those doors that morning, loaded onto the wagons, delivered to the resorts and the fish camps and the small-town butcher shops that were still pretending they needed lake ice in the spring of 1961. But they did not need lake ice anymore. The resorts had electric refrigeration. The fish camps bought bagged ice from the filling station on the highway. The butcher shops in Rhinelander and Woodruff had their own walk-in cold rooms. The world that had bought Gus Whitaker's ice for 15 winters had quietly stopped existing, and the men who had run that world had quietly stopped calling, and the cooperative books had quietly stopped balancing. And now the trade was finished, and the man was finished, and the doors were gonna be locked. Gus Whitaker put the key into the padlock. The lock was old. It had been on the door since 1921. His father had installed it himself when his father was a young man, and Gus was not yet born. The lock had a particular feel to it, a particular weight in the hand. You had to push the key in firmly, and you had to turn it slowly, and you had to listen for the click. He pushed the key in. He turned it slowly. He listened. The click came, small, final. And then Gus Whitaker, who had not cried at his mother's funeral in 1948, and who had not cried at his father's funeral in May of 1960, and who had not cried when his only son had been born stillborn in 1957, and who had not cried any of the days of the cold, or the hunger, or the failed harvests in between, put his bare hand on the door of the ice house and lowered his head and cried. The tears froze on his beard before they reached his chin. He stood there for a long time. The wind came down off the lake. A raven called somewhere in the pines. Then he straightened up. He wiped his face with the back of his bare hand. He hung the key on the padlock by its leather thong. He picked up his canvas tool roll from the ramp. He walked away from the ice house, and he did not look back. He was 33 years old. He would live another 47 years. He would never open those doors again, and he did not know on that afternoon in March of 1961 that 63 years later, on a cold gray afternoon in February of 2025, a young woman with his hands and his patience and his unblinking Scandinavian quiet would stand in front of those same doors with that same key and would slide them open at last. That young woman was his granddaughter, and she did not know yet what he had left inside. This is her story. The girl was 21 years old, and her name was Hazel Whitaker, and she had been born in a small frame house on the edge of Eagle River, Wisconsin, in the autumn of 2003, the only child of a woman named Margaret Whitaker, who everyone in town had called Maggie. Maggie had worked the front desk at Pine Ridge Resort for 22 years. Pine Ridge was the kind of resort that had been built in 1946 and had never been updated, and the cabins still smelled like cedar smoke and old fishing tackle, and the dock pilings still groaned in the wind off the lake. And the people who came there every summer were the children and grandchildren of the people who had come there every summer for 60 years. Maggie had loved that resort. She had been a quiet woman with strong hands and a slow, careful Scandinavian smile. And she had loved the lake, and she had loved the loons, and she had loved her daughter, Hazel, more than she had ever told anyone. Hazel's father had been a fishing guide from Duluth, Minnesota. He had come through Eagle River one summer in 2002. He had stayed for 6 weeks. He had left in the middle of August. Maggie had told no one she was pregnant until October, and by then the fishing guide from Duluth was long gone and would never be heard from again. Maggie had made a quiet decision. The kind of quiet decision many northern Wisconsin women of her line had made before her, which was to raise the child without the man, and to let the man's absence speak for itself. Hazel had her mother's strong hands. She had her grandfather's pale gray eyes. She had the long, quiet patience of women who had been raised in pine country for 4 generations. She had been 7 years old on the Sunday morning in March of 2010 when her mother died. It had been a brain aneurysm. It had happened in the kitchen of the small frame house while Maggie was making coffee. Hazel had been in the living room watching cartoons. She had heard her mother fall. She had run into the kitchen. She had seen her mother on the floor. She had picked up the telephone and she had dialed the operator the way her mother had taught her, to dial the operator if anything ever went wrong. And the operator had sent the ambulance, and the ambulance had come, and Maggie had been pronounced dead at the small hospital in Eagle River at 11:46 in the morning. Hazel did not cry at the funeral. She wore a black dress that had belonged to a neighbor's daughter. The dress was a size too large in the shoulders. She stood beside the casket, and she looked at her mother's face. and she did not cry. And the women of Eagle River who had known Maggie for 22 years thought to themselves that the child was in shock and that the tears would come later, and that someone would need to watch her carefully when they did. But Hazel was not in shock. Hazel was 7 years old, and she remembered something her grandfather had told her when she was 4. She remembered standing on the frozen surface of a lake with her tiny hand inside his enormous, calloused hand. And she remembered him kneeling down and looking her in the eyes and saying with the careful, slow gravity that Swedish men of that generation reserved for the most important things they would ever say to a child, "People who work on the ice do not cry on the ice. The salt weakens the surface. A weakened surface is how a person falls through." Hazel had not understood it when she was 4. She did not entirely understand it when she was 7. But she understood it well enough to keep her chin steady at her mother's funeral. She understood it well enough to stand in the borrowed black dress and look at the casket and not let one tear fall. She would carry that lesson for the rest of her life. She would not understand what it really meant until she was 21 years old and kneeling in front of a pine wall in an empty, cold room with a small iron pick in her trembling hand. But that day was still 14 years away. The woman who came to claim her was her mother's older sister. Her name was Eleanor Whitaker. She was 61 years old. She had been the head librarian at the Eagle River Public Library for 41 years. She had never married. She had never had children of her own. She had lived alone for most of her adult life in the small white frame house on the edge of town that her parents had bought in 1952. Eleanor had been in the front pew at her sister Maggie's funeral. She had watched the 7-year-old girl in the borrowed black dress stand beside the casket and not cry. She had watched the women of Eagle River whisper to each other behind their hands. And Eleanor Whitaker had made a decision in that front pew that no one else in that church had made, and no one else in that church was ever gonna make. And the decision was this: Hazel was coming home with her. Tonight. And forever. There was no other family. There was a fishing guide somewhere in Duluth who did not know he had a daughter, and who would not have wanted her if he had known. There was a system of foster homes in Wisconsin that took in children whose mothers died and whose fathers were absent. And Eleanor Whitaker had spent 41 years as a librarian, and she knew what that system did to a 7-year-old girl in a borrowed black dress. Eleanor had not hesitated. Hesitation, she would tell Hazel many years later, was a luxury she could not afford. Hazel had moved into the small white frame house on the edge of Eagle River on the 3rd of March, 2010, 6 days after her mother's funeral. She had brought one cardboard box of clothes and one stuffed rabbit, and a small frame photograph of her mother in a yellow sundress on the dock at Pine Ridge. Eleanor had given her the upstairs bedroom that had once been Maggie's room. The walls were still painted the pale blue Maggie had chosen when she was 13. The curtains were the same curtains. The bookshelf still held Maggie's old books. Hazel had sat on the bed and looked around the room and had not cried. Eleanor had sat down beside her. She had been a 61-year-old woman in a wool cardigan and reading glasses on a chain, and she had not known how to talk to a 7-year-old girl. She had never known how to talk to children. She had spent her whole career talking to other people's children across a library desk, and she had never been any good at it. But she had been good at something else. She had reached up to the shelf above Maggie's old bed, and she had taken down a small leather-bound book. The book was old. The leather was cracked. The spine was repaired with twine. She had handed it to Hazel, and she had said, in her careful, measured librarian's voice, "This was your grandfather's. He wrote in it for 30 years. I'm going to read it to you on the winter evenings. It is not a fairy tale. It is better than a fairy tale. Would you like that?" Hazel had taken the book in her small hands. She had looked at the cracked leather cover. She had looked up at her aunt with her grandfather's pale gray eyes. Yes, she had said. That was the first word she said in the house that would become her home for the next 14 years. The house held 3 things that mattered. Eleanor had made sure of that. Above the fireplace in the living room hung a long, iron-toothed ice saw. The blade was 4 feet long. The teeth were 8 inches deep. The wooden crossbar handle had been worn smooth by 60 years of working hands. A faded rope loop hung from the top. The same loop Gus Whitaker had used to hang the saw from a nail in the ice house on the night of March 8, 1961, before he had carried it home for the last time. In the hall closet on the top shelf, where a child would have to climb on a chair to reach it, was a heavy canvas tool roll. The waxed cotton was darkened with age. The roll held Gus Whitaker's personal set of ice tools, a scoring chisel, a small handpick, a pair of block tongs, a packing hook, a graduated set of ice saws ranging from 8 inches to 3 feet, each tool wrapped in its own pocket, each tool in working condition, each tool oiled once a year by Eleanor on the first warm Saturday of June, exactly as her father had taught her to do when she was a young girl. And on the small bookshelf beside Eleanor's reading chair was the pamphlet, The Ice Harvester's Handbook, self-published in 1934 by a man named Olaf Bergstrom of Minocqua, Wisconsin. The original edition had been 48 pages. Gus Whitaker had added pencil annotations in the margins for 30 years. By the time he died in 2008, almost every page had his careful, slanted, Swedish-inflected handwriting running alongside the printed text. The corrections of a man who had read the book for the first time in 1946 and had spent the rest of his working life finding the small ways the book was wrong. Eleanor read from that pamphlet to Hazel on the long winter evenings. She did not read fairy tales. She read about ice. She read about the way blue-black ice will hold 1,000-pound ice, and the way white ice will not hold a 60-pound dog, and the way gray ice will not hold anything at all. She read about the names of the lakes Gus had worked: Catfish Lake, Cranberry Lake, Butternut Lake, Long Lake, Anvil Lake. She read about the weights of the blocks and the methods of the crews and the customers who had taken their ice for 63 winters in a row. Hazel listened. She had been 7 years old, then 8, then 12, then 16, then 18. For 14 years, she listened to the stories of the ice trade of Vilas County in the careful, measured voice of a librarian aunt who had loved her without ever quite knowing how to say so. The stories went inside her, the way the lessons of grandfathers go inside their grandchildren, not all at once, not consciously, but layer by layer, winter by winter, the way the rings of a white pine record the cold of the decades. She did not know yet what those stories were for. She would find out on a Tuesday evening in January of 2025. The kitchen of the small white frame house was warm that night. Eleanor was 76 years old. She had retired from the library 3 years before. She had not been quite the same since the retirement. Not unwell, not weak, just slower, just quieter, just more aware of the way the house had stairs she had to climb, and a furnace pilot she had to relight and a snow shovel she could no longer lift. Hazel was 20 p.m. She was standing at the stove, stirring potato soup. She had been working at Pine Ridge Resort for 3 winters, doing the same maintenance her mother had once done before her. And her hands were calloused, and her shoulders were strong, and her gray eyes were quiet. Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table. She folded her hands. She waited until Hazel turned around. Then she said in the careful, measured voice of a woman who had spent 41 years learning how to deliver difficult information to other people's children without raising her own blood pressure. "I have made a decision, Hazel. I want to tell you about it now while we have time to think it through." Hazel turned off the burner. She sat down at the table. She did not say anything. Eleanor said, "I have been accepted at the Northwood Senior Living Facility in Rhinelander. I have been on the waiting list for 9 months. I was notified in December. I move on the 1st of February. Hazel did not say anything. Eleanor said, "The house has to be sold. I have spoken to a realtor. The listing goes up at the end of this month. The realtor believes the house will sell quickly. Lakefront properties in this town always do." Hazel did not say anything. Eleanor said, "I have spoken with Adelaide Lindgren. You remember Adelaide. She was on the library board with me for 20 years. Adelaide has agreed to let you stay in her basement for up to 3 months while you figure out what comes next. The basement is warm. There is a private bathroom. You will not have to pay rent." Hazel did not say anything. Eleanor took off her reading glasses. She set them on the table. She looked at her niece with the same careful eyes she had used to look at her sister Maggie's 7-year-old daughter in a borrowed black dress 14 years before. "I am sorry, Hazel," she said. "I have loved having you here. You have been the joy of my old age. But I cannot keep the house, and I cannot take you with me to Rhinelander. Northwood, senior living is not a place for a 21-year-old woman. You deserve more than a folding cot in an old woman's apartment. You deserve a place that is yours." Hazel still did not say anything. She got up from the table. She went to the stove. She turned the burner back on. She stirred the potato soup. She poured 2 bowls. She set 1 bowl in front of her aunt. She sat down with her own bowl. She picked up her spoon. She ate the soup slowly and carefully, and without speaking. When the soup was finished, she washed both bowls. She dried them with a dish towel. She put them back in the cupboard. She kissed her aunt on the top of her gray head. She went upstairs to the bedroom that had once been her mother's bedroom, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time without moving. And she did not cry, because her grandfather had taught her when she was 4 years old on the surface of a frozen lake that people who work on the ice do not cry on the ice. She had not understood that lesson when she was 4. She had understood part of it when she was 7. She understood more of it that night at 21 years old, sitting on the edge of her mother's old bed, in a house that was about to be sold. and a life that was about to be taken apart. But she did not yet understand the deepest part of it. She would understand the deepest part of it on a cold, gray afternoon in February 4 weeks later, kneeling in front of a wall of pine planks in an empty, cold room, 63 years asleep. She moved to Adelaide Lindgren's house on the 1st of February. Adelaide was 72 years old. She had retired from teaching 4th grade at Eagle River Elementary School 12 years before. She had never married. She had lived alone in a small 2-story house 3 blocks from the library where Eleanor had worked for 41 years. Adelaide's basement was finished. There was a sofa that pulled out into a bed. There was a private bathroom. There was a small window that looked out into a snow-covered backyard. There was a wood stove that Adelaide kept burning all through January and February, so that the basement stayed warm, even when the upstairs furnace cycled off in the night. Hazel was grateful. She told Adelaide so. Adelaide had nodded the small, careful Scandinavian nod that women of her generation in northern Wisconsin used to acknowledge gratitude without making the giver of the gratitude feel awkward about it. Hazel had $940 in her savings account. She had no car. She had been using Eleanor's old Subaru Forester for 3 years, and Eleanor was selling the Forester with the house. She had a couch in a basement for 3 months. She had her grandfather's canvas tool roll. She had brought it with her in the back of the Subaru on the day she moved. She had set it on the small dresser in Adelaide's basement, and she had not opened it. She had her grandfather's eyesore. Eleanor had given it to her on the last morning in the white frame house. Hazel had wrapped it in a wool blanket and had laid it carefully across the back seat of the Subaru. She had brought it down to Adelaide's basement. She had leaned it against the wall behind the sofa, where Adelaide would not have to look at it every time she came downstairs to put a load of laundry in the dryer. For 2 weeks, Hazel did nothing. She went to work at Pine Ridge Resort during the day. She cleaned cabins. She patched a section of dock that had been damaged by ice heave. She replaced 2 cracked copper pipes in the oldest cabin. She came home to Adelaide's basement in the evening. She heated soup on a hot plate Adelaide had set up for her. She read books. She watched the snow come down through the small basement window. She did not know what she was going to do. She was 21 years old. She had $940. She had a couch for 3 months. She had no plan. She had something else, though. Something she had not had at any other moment in her life. Something her mother had not had, and her Aunt Eleanor had not had, and even her grandfather Gus had not had exactly in the same way. She had the awareness of weight, of the specific weight of not having a place that was hers. The specific weight of being the last of a line. The specific weight of standing at the edge of something and not being able to see the bottom. It was a heavy weight. It was an unfamiliar weight. It was the weight that men of her grandfather's generation had carried after the wars, and that men of her great-grandfather's generation had carried after the immigrant crossings, and that women of her aunt's generation had carried in the long silences of unmarried libraries, and that her mother Maggie had carried in 22 years at the front desk of a resort she had loved more than she had ever told anyone. It was the weight of a person who has nothing left to lose, because everything that could be lost has already been lost. And it was, although Hazel did not yet know it, the precise weight a person needs to carry before she can do an unusual and unreasonable thing. The unusual and unreasonable thing presented itself on a Wednesday evening in the third week of February. Hazel was sitting on Adelaide's basement couch, with her laptop balanced on her knees and a chipped white mug of black coffee on the small side table beside her. The wood stove was burning low. The snow was coming down hard outside the basement window. The wind was up. She was looking at the Vilas County surplus property page. She had been looking at it off and on for about a week. Not with a plan. With a feeling. The feeling was a small, quiet, steady pressure at the back of her ribs. And it had something to do with her grandfather, Gus. And it had something to do with the ice saw above the fireplace in the white frame house. And it had something to do with the 5 lakes he had named for her when she was 4 years old. The page listed 23 properties. Most of them were small. A vacant lot in Phelps. A burned-out farmhouse in Saner. A boat slip with no boat. A tool shed on a quarter-acre parcel. The 4th listing on the page was different. She had to read the description twice before she understood what she was reading. Commercial timber frame building. Sawdust-insulated double walls. Approximately 2,400 square feet on a single story. Steep metal roof. 2 tall oak loading doors. Original wooden loading ramp. Sited on a 1.8-acre parcel on the north shore of Butternut Lake, approximately 8 miles south of Eagle River. Original construction date 1898. Original use commercial ice harvesting. Final operational season 1961. Building has been vacant since 1961. County took possession in 1989 for unpaid taxes. Building was delisted from the Vilas County Historical Registry in 2015. Sold as is. No warranties. No inspections offered. Asking price $10. Hazel set the laptop on the couch beside her. She walked across the basement to the small dresser. She put her hand on the canvas tool roll. The wax cotton was rough and familiar under her palm. She thought about a January morning in 2008, when she had been 4 years old, and her grandfather, Gus, had been 80 years old, and he had taken her out onto the frozen surface of a lake. And he had knelt down in the snow and he had named the 5 lakes of Vilas County for her in the slow, reverent voice that old Scandinavian men use for the most important things they will ever say. Catfish Lake, Cranberry Lake, Butternut Lake, Long Lake, Anvil Lake, the 3rd lake he had named for her. She walked back to the couch. She sat down. She picked up her phone. She called the number on the Vilas County surplus property page. The phone rang 4 times. A man answered. His voice was the slow, careful voice of a Vilas County civil servant who had been doing the same job for 31 years. "This is Arlen Nyquist," he said. "County Clerk's office. How may I help you?" Hazel did not know yet that the man on the other end of the phone was the son of the bookkeeper who had counted out the silver dollars of the Butternut Lake Ice Company for 26 years. She did not know yet that the man on the other end of the phone had been 3 years old on the afternoon of March 8, 1961, and had watched his father come home from the ice house with red eyes, and had heard his father tell his mother that a century had died that day. She did not know yet that the man on the other end of the phone had been holding the iron key her grandfather had hung on the padlock 63 years before, holding it in a drawer of his office, in the basement of the Vilas County Courthouse, holding it and waiting, holding it for 36 years without quite knowing who he was waiting for. She only knew that she had $940 in her savings account and a couch in a basement for 3 months and a heavy canvas tool roll on a dresser across the room. And she said, in the steady, quiet voice of a young woman who had finally found the precise weight required to do an unusual and unreasonable thing. "My name is Hazel Whitaker. I am calling about the ice house on Butternut Lake." There was a silence on the other end of the line. It was not a long silence by the measurements of ordinary conversation. It was perhaps 4 seconds. But it was the kind of silence that has weight inside it. The kind of silence a man falls into when he has been waiting for a phone call for 36 years. And the phone call has finally come. And he needs a moment to be sure he heard the name correctly. Then Arlen Nyquist said, in the careful, slow voice of a man who is trying to keep his hands steady on the receiver, "Whitaker. Did you say Whitaker?" "Yes," said Hazel. "Are you any relation to Gustav Whitaker, the ice master?" "He was my grandfather," said Hazel. There was another silence, a shorter one this time. Then Arlen Nyquist said, "Can you come to the courthouse tomorrow morning, Miss Whitaker? There are some things we need to discuss. In person." Hazel said yes. She said she would be there at 9. She set the phone down on the basement couch beside her. She looked at the laptop screen. She looked at the photograph of the long, low cedar-sided building under the snow on the shore of the lake. She looked at the asking price of $10. She did not feel excited. She did not feel afraid. She felt only the small, quiet, steady pressure at the back of her ribs that had been there for 2 weeks. The pressure had a direction now. The pressure was pointing her at something. She closed the laptop. She went upstairs to the kitchen. Adelaide Lindgren was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the local newspaper. Hazel said, "I need to borrow your car tomorrow morning, if that is all right with you." Adelaide looked up. She studied Hazel's face for a moment with the slow, patient attention of a woman who had spent 40 years reading the faces of 4th graders. "Where are you going, dear?" said Adelaide. "I am going to the courthouse," said Hazel, "to buy a building." Adelaide did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Take the Forester. The keys are on the hook by the door. The gas tank is full." She did not ask what building. She did not ask why. She had been a teacher for 40 years and a librarian's friend for 50 years. And she knew the look of a young person who had found the thing she was supposed to do. You did not ask questions of that look. You handed over the car keys. Hazel said, "Thank you," and went back downstairs. She did not sleep much that night. She lay on the pull-out couch in Adelaide's basement, and she watched the small basement window go from black to dark blue to gray. And she thought about her grandfather, Gus, and about the 3rd lake on his list of 5. In the morning, she drank a cup of black coffee. She put on her work boots and her heavy wool coat. She picked up her canvas tool roll from the dresser, and she walked out to the Forester in the gray February dawn. The Vilas County Courthouse stood at the corner of Wall Street and Railroad Street in the small town of Eagle River. It was a 2-story building of brown brick that had been built in 1923. The clock on the front tower had been keeping accurate time for 102 years. Hazel parked the Forester on the street. She walked up the worn granite steps. She pushed open the heavy oak door. The lobby smelled of floor wax and old radiator heat. The county clerk's office was in the basement. She walked down the stone stairs. The hallway was narrow. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. The door was open. The office was small. A long wooden counter ran the length of the room. Behind the counter, at a desk piled with manila folders, sat a man in his late 60s wearing a blue plaid flannel shirt and a pair of reading glasses on a leather cord. He had white hair. He had the kind of weathered face that men in northern Wisconsin get from 60 winters of looking out over frozen water. He looked up when Hazel came in. He stood up slowly. He came to the counter. He took off his reading glasses. He set them down on the wood. He looked at Hazel for a long, quiet moment with the careful eyes of a man who had been waiting for this exact moment and was not entirely sure how to begin. "You have your grandfather's eyes," he said finally. Hazel did not say anything. "I am Arlen Nyquist," the man said. "Vilas County Clerk, 31 years in this office. My father was Eric Nyquist. He was the bookkeeper of the Butternut Lake Ice Company from 1935 until the company closed in 1961. My father knew your grandfather for 26 years. They were not friends exactly. Friendship was not a word Swedish men of that generation used easily. But they worked together every winter for 26 winters. And my father told me when I was a boy that Gus Whitaker was the finest iceman in Vilas County, and that the Butternut Lake Ice Company would not have lasted a single winter without him." Hazel listened. She did not interrupt. "Arlen said I was 3 years old on the 8th of March, 1961, the day your grandfather locked the doors. I remember almost nothing of that day except this. My father came home in the evening. He took off his boots in the mudroom. He sat down at the kitchen table. He did not say hello to me. He did not say hello to my mother. He sat at that table with his hands folded and his eyes red, and he said to my mother in a voice I had never heard before, in a voice I have never heard since, 'Ingrid, today a century died.'" Arlen stopped. He took a slow breath. He pulled open a wooden drawer behind the counter. He reached inside. He brought out an iron key. The key was heavy. The shaft was black with 63 years of patina. The bow was wrapped with a leather thong that had darkened to the color of old molasses. He set the key on the counter between them. "This is the key your grandfather hung on the padlock of the Butternut Lake Ice House on the night of March 8th, 1961, said Arlen. "The cooperative dissolved in 1962. The deed reverted to the 4 founding families. The 4 families let the building sit. They could not bring themselves to tear it down. None of them wanted it. None of them could afford the taxes. The taxes went unpaid. In 1989, the county took possession." Arlen paused. He looked down at the key. "When the county took possession, my father had been dead for 7 years. But my father had given me the key in 1980, on the last Christmas of his life. He had wrapped it in brown paper. He had not put a tag on it. He had told me only this. He had told me, 'Arlen, hold this key. Someday someone will come for it. Do not give it to anyone else. You will know who it is for when they walk in the door.'" Hazel did not move. "I have held this key for 45 years, said Arlen Nyquist. "I am 67 years old." I've been the Vilas County clerk for 31 years. I have processed 83 surplus property sales in my career. None of them have been this one. None of them have been you." He pushed the key across the wooden counter toward her. "The deed costs $10, he said. "The key is free. Welcome home, Miss Whitaker." Hazel reached into the front pocket of her coat. She took out a $10 bill. It was folded twice. She had carried it in that pocket since the previous afternoon. The bill was warm from her body. She placed the $10 bill on the counter. Arlen Nyquist stamped the deed with a brass stamp. He countersigned it with a black pen. He slid the deed across the counter to her. He picked up the $10 bill. He put it carefully into the cash drawer. Then he picked up the iron key on its leather thong. He held it for one long moment in his open palm, the way a man holds the last living thing of a generation that is past. He placed the key in Hazel Whitaker's hand. Her hand closed around it. The iron was cold. The leather was warm. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She walked out of the basement office. She walked up the stone stairs. She walked through the lobby. She walked down the granite steps and across the sidewalk to Adelaide Lindgren's Forester. She set the key on the passenger seat. She set the deed on the dashboard. She set the canvas tool roll on the floor of the cab. She drove south out of Eagle River. She drove on County Road G past the gas station and the hardware store and the small lumber yard. She drove past the turnoff for Pine Ridge Resort. She drove 8 miles south through the pine country and the snow-covered pasture and the long, flat stretches of frozen wetland. She turned east onto a small, unpaved road called Butternut Lake Lane. The road had not been plowed since November. The county did not maintain seasonal lanes in the winter. Hazel parked the Forester at the plowed turnaround near the county road. She picked up the canvas tool roll. She slung it over her shoulder. She put the iron key into the front pocket of her coat. She buttoned the pocket. She began to walk. The road was a half-mile long. The snow was knee-deep. The pines rose on both sides, dark green against the gray February sky. The only sound was her boots breaking through the crusted top layer of snow and her own breathing inside the wool collar of her coat. She walked for 20 minutes. She came around a final bend in the road. The pines opened up, and there it was. The Butternut Lake Ice House stood at the top of a gentle slope above the frozen lake, exactly as the photograph on the county website had shown it, long and low and quiet under the snow. The cedar siding had gone the color of weathered bone. The steep metal roof was streaked with rust. The 2 tall oak loading doors at the lakeside end were chained shut with a heavy iron padlock. The loading ramp descended from the doors in a straight, unbroken line toward the surface of the lake. White pines surrounded the building on 3 sides. The frozen surface of Butternut Lake stretched out below it, flat and pale, fading at the far shore into the gray haze of the winter horizon. Hazel stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment. She did not move. She did not breathe. She did not feel cold. She felt only the small, quiet, steady pressure at the back of her ribs. And she felt now that the pressure had arrived at the place it had been pointing her toward all along. She walked across the clearing through the deep snow. She walked up to the tall loading doors. She stood in front of them. The padlock hung from the chain. The leather thong of the iron key was the same leather, the same thong her grandfather had wound through the bow of the key 63 years before. She took the key out of her coat pocket. She held it in her bare hand. She put it into the padlock. She turned it. Nothing happened. The lock had not been opened in 63 years, and it did not want to open now. The tumblers had rusted in place. The wards had seized. Hazel did not force it. She remembered something her grandfather had told her once when she was 4 years old, when he had been showing her how to thread a leather strap through the buckle of a small ice harness he had made for her. "Patience is the only tool that never breaks," he had said. "A man who is patient with cold metal will never be defeated by cold metal. A man who is impatient with cold metal will be defeated by cold metal every time." Hazel stood in the snow in front of the loading doors. She breathed slowly. She felt the iron key in her bare hand. She felt the cold come up through her boots from the frozen earth. She let the cold inside her, and she let the cold steady her hand. She turned the key again, slowly, with no force, with only the patience of a granddaughter who had been taught when she was very small that some things will only open for hands that are willing to wait. The tumblers moved. The wards turned. The lock opened. The chain fell away from the doors and clattered against the wooden ramp. Hazel stood looking at the chain on the snow for a moment. Then she put both her hands against the seam where the doors met. She pushed. The doors were heavy. They had not been moved in 63 years. The iron track at the top of the doorway was clotted with rust. She put her shoulder against the right door, and she pushed harder. The door groaned. It moved an inch. She pushed again. 2 inches. 3 inches. A foot. The iron wheels in the track screeched against the rust. She got the right door open 3 feet. That was enough. She stepped sideways into the building. Inside, the world changed. The cold room was a single enormous space, 80 feet long and 30 feet wide, 15 feet high to the peak of the rafters. The walls were the sawdust-insulated double walls her grandfather had described to her once when she was 5 years old. The outer wall of cedar siding, the 12-inch cavity packed with sawdust, the inner wall of tight-fitted tongue and groove pine planking dark with 63 years of cold room humidity. The floor was heavy timber planking laid over a drainage bed of gravel and sand. Narrow drainage channels were cut into the planks at regular intervals, sloping toward a drain at the lakeside end. The ceiling was open to the rafters. The rafters were hand-hewn pine beams, the bark still on their undersides, spanning the full 30-foot width of the building. The beams had been cut from trees that had stood on the shore of Butternut Lake in 1898. When Hazel's great-grandfather Niels had been a small child in Sweden, when her grandfather Gus had not yet been born, when the 4 founding families of the cooperative had been young men in their 20s, pooling their savings to build a place that would feed a small economy for 63 years. The cold room was empty. The last blocks of ice had melted away in the summer of 1961. But the room was not warm. The sawdust insulation in the double walls still worked. After 63 years, the temperature inside the cold room, even in February with the door cracked open, was perceptibly colder than the air outside. Not the cold of weather, a deeper cold. The mineral cold of a building that had been engineered to hold winter inside itself even in August. Hazel set the canvas tool roll on the floor just inside the door. She walked the length of the cold room, slowly, carefully, the way she imagined her grandfather had walked it on the morning of his last harvest, the way her great-grandfather had walked it for 17 winters before him, the way the founding ice masters had walked it for the 17 years before that. Her boots made small, careful prints in the thin layer of dust that had settled on the timber floor. She walked the 80 feet. She turned around. She walked the 80 feet back. She stood in the middle of the cold room and she looked up at the rafters. She looked at the pine planking of the inner walls. She listened. The building was utterly silent. No wind reached inside. No bird called within these walls. The only sound was her own steady breathing, and even her breath made no echo. The sawdust in the walls absorbed sound the way it absorbed temperature. She would have stayed there for an hour. She would have stayed there for a day. But something on the north wall caught her eye. She walked toward it. Halfway down the north wall, about 4 feet above the floor, was a section of inner pine planking that did not match the planking around it. 3 planks in a row, maybe 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. The planks had been cut shorter than the planks on either side. The cut ends had been sanded smooth. The edges had been fitted flush. The work was excellent. Almost no one would have noticed. A carpenter would have noticed. A child who had been raised by a librarian who read from an ice harvester's handbook on winter evenings would have noticed. A young woman who had been taught at 4 years old to read the grain of lake ice for thickness, who had been taught to see the difference between blue-black ice and white ice and gray ice, who had been taught to see the small details that meant a surface would hold or would not hold would have noticed. Hazel knelt down on the timber floor in front of the 3 planks. She set her bare hand against the wood. The grain of the 3 planks ran at a slightly different angle than the grain of the surrounding wall. The difference was a few degrees. The difference was almost nothing. The difference was everything. She ran her fingertips along the top edge of the panel. There was a thin wooden lip almost invisible that held the 3 planks in place from above. There were no nails. There were no screws. The panel was held by friction and by a hidden hinge of some kind along the bottom. She remembered her grandfather Gus telling her when she was 4 years old that the ice would always tell you the truth if you were patient enough to ask. She pressed her thumb upward against the lip. She felt the panel give. She slid her fingers into the small gap that opened above the planks. She pulled gently outward. The 3 planks came toward her as a single panel. They were hinged at the bottom by a thin strip of leather. The leather stiffened by 63 years of cold, but not broken. Still flexible enough to function exactly as it had been designed to function. The panel swung down into Hazel's waiting hands. Behind the panel, in the 12-inch cavity between the inner pine wall and the outer cedar wall, the sawdust had been cleared out in a rectangular space about 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall. The space had been lined with a folded piece of heavy waxed canvas, and resting on the waxed canvas, perfectly preserved, perfectly dry, was a small wooden chest, hand-built, pine, about 18 inches long and 12 inches wide and 10 inches tall. A small brass hasp held the lid closed. A small brass padlock hung from the hasp. Hazel knelt on the floor in front of the cavity, and she did not move for a long time. She looked at the chest. The chest looked at her. 63 years had passed. 63 winters had come down off the lake and beaten against the cedar siding and rattled the metal roof. 63 summers had come up off the lake and pressed humidity against the outer wall, and the sawdust in the cavity had done its work. The wax canvas had done its work. The cold room had done its work. The chest was as dry as the day it had been hidden. Hazel slid her hands into the cavity. She lifted the chest out. It was heavier than she had expected. She carried it carefully across the cold room. She walked through the gap in the loading doors. She came out onto the loading ramp. The gray February light fell on her. The cold air filled her lungs. The frozen lake stretched out below her, flat and wide and patient. She sat down on the snow-dusted planking of the ramp. She set the chest beside her. A raven called somewhere in the white pines. The sound carried across the frozen surface of the lake and came back to her, changed the way sounds come back. Across great cold spaces in northern country, she opened the canvas tool roll. She found the smallest handpick. The pick had been her grandfather's. The handle was bone-polished smooth by his hand over 30 years of work. The point was steel sharpened on a whetstone every spring before the harvest began. She put the point of the pick against the brass padlock. She did not hurry. She remembered what her grandfather had taught her about cold metal, that it would only open for hands that were willing to wait. She worked the pick into the brass. She listened for the small click of the wards. She worked the pick. She listened. The lock gave. Hazel set the pick down on the ramp beside her. She slid the broken padlock out of the hasp. She set it on the ramp. She put her hands on the lid of the chest. She did not open it yet. She sat for one long moment with her hands on the lid of the chest, and she let herself feel for the first time in 14 years the full weight of what her grandfather had taught her. He had taught her to read ice. She had thought when she was 4 years old that he was teaching her how to stay safe on a frozen lake. He had been teaching her something deeper. He had been teaching her how to recognize the surface of a thing. He had been teaching her that some surfaces hold and some surfaces do not. He had been teaching her that the difference between blue-black ice and white ice and gray ice was the difference between truth and almost truth and lie. He had been teaching her to see, and she had seen. She had seen a wall that did not match itself. She had seen what her grandfather had hidden. And she had seen it because her grandfather had spent the last year of his life when he was 80 years old. And she was 4, teaching her how to see. Hazel Whitaker, 21 years old, sitting on the snow-dusted loading ramp of an ice house she had bought for $10, opened the lid of a wooden chest that had not been opened in 63 years. Inside the chest, laid carefully on a folded square of waxed canvas, were 3 things. A leather-bound book, small, thick, hand-stitched along the spine. A heavy canvas pouch tied at the top with a length of waxed cord. Something heavy and metallic inside. And a folded letter on heavy cream-colored paper, sealed across the seam with a small dark blob of pine pitch. The pine pitch had hardened into a brittle disc over 6 decades. The disc was the color of dried blood. Hazel reached into the chest. She took out the leather-bound book first. She opened it. The first page was inscribed in a hand she did not know. The handwriting was square and disciplined, the careful copperplate that men of the 19th century learned in country schoolhouses by lamplight. The inscription read, Harvest Record. Butternut Lake Ice Company began this 14th day of January 1898. Sven Olsen Ice Master. Hazel turned the page. The second page was the record of the first harvest. 9-inch ice, 210 blocks cut. The names of 7 men on the crew. The names of the customers. A small notation about the temperature and the condition of the saws. She turned another page. Another harvest. Another year. Another season. She turned pages for a long time. The handwriting changed. Sven Olsen gave way to Lars Bjork in 1912. Lars Bjork gave way to Niels Whittaker in 1928. 28. Niels Whittaker gave way to Gustav Whittaker in 1946. The handwriting got smaller toward the end. The Swedish inflected slant of Gus Whittaker's pencil filled the last 20 pages of the book. She turned to the final entry. She did not have to look for it. The book opened naturally to that page, the way a book opens to a page that has been read and reread and folded and pressed flat by the hands of the man who wrote it. The handwriting was careful, slanted, quiet. Final harvest. 14-inch clear blue-black ice. 342 blocks cut. Crew of 4. G. Whittaker, R. Mackin, T. Matson, H. Bjork. Air temperature 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Water temperature 33 degrees Fahrenheit. This is the last commercial harvest on Butternut Lake. The resorts have all gone to electric refrigeration. The fish camps buy bagged ice from the filling station in Eagle River. The butcher shops in Rhinelander and Woodruff have their own cold rooms now. There is no further need for a man who cuts lake ice with a handsaw and stores it in sawdust. I am locking the doors tonight. Gustav Whittaker, Ice Master. March 8th, 1961. Hazel closed the book. Her hands were very steady. She had not cried at her mother's funeral when she was 7. She had not cried at her grandfather's funeral when she was 5. She did not cry now, but something inside her, something that had been waiting for 14 years to find its name, found its name on the snow-dusted loading ramp of the Butternut Lake Ice House on a gray February afternoon in 2025. She set the harvest log carefully on the ramp beside her. She reached back into the chest. She took out the canvas pouch. She loosened the waxed cord at the top. She tipped the pouch carefully onto her open palm. Silver coins poured out into her hand. Heavy. Cold. Smelling faintly of beeswax and old canvas. She let them pile up in her cupped palms. She let them spill onto her knees. She let them collect on the planks of the ramp. She did not yet know how many there were. She did not yet know what they were worth. She did not yet know that her grandfather had been the keeper of a small private fund the 4 founding families had contributed to for 63 years, and that the fund had been intended to repair the building if the building ever needed repair, and that no repair had ever been needed, and so the fund had simply grown. She knew only that they were beautiful in her hands. She let the coins lie on her knees and on the ramp around her. She turned back to the chest. She took out the folded letter. The pine pitch seal cracked under her thumb with a small dry sound and came away in a single brittle disc. She unfolded the heavy cream paper. The handwriting on the page was her grandfather's, the same handwriting she had read in the harvest log, the same handwriting she had seen in the margins of the ice harvester's handbook, on the shelf beside Eleanor's reading chair. For 14 years. The same hand that had guided her hand to the wooden grip of a saw. She had been too small to pull. She began to read. To whoever finds this chest, my name is Gus Whitaker. I have been the ice master of the Butternut Lake Ice Company from the spring of 1946 until tonight, the 8th of March, 1961. I am 33 years old. Tomorrow morning I will not come back to this building. The trade is finished. The world that bought our ice has stopped existing. I have locked the doors, and I have hung the key on the padlock, and I will walk away from this place at sunset, and I will not return. I am leaving this chest behind me, sealed inside the wall of the cold room. I am leaving it because I cannot bring myself to burn the harvest log, and I do not trust banks with the silver, and I cannot put either one inside the house I share with my wife and my daughter, because someday that house will be sold, and the things inside it will be scattered. The log is the only complete record of 63 years of ice harvesting on this lake. Every harvest, every crew, every block. If the log is lost, the record is lost. The silver is what the 4 founding families of this cooperative have contributed across 63 years toward the repair of this building. The repair has never been needed. The fund has simply grown. It is not my silver. It is the silver of the families who built this place. I am leaving it for whoever finds this chest. Use it for the building if the building still stands. Use it for yourself if the building has fallen. I do not know who will find this chest. I am 33 years old, and I expect to live another 40 or 50 years, and I expect to die without ever knowing whether anyone opened the wall panel. That is all right. A man who has spent 15 winters on the surface of a frozen lake with a saw in his hands has learned to be patient with outcomes he cannot control. Read the ice clearly. Gustav Whitaker, Ice Master. March 8th, 1961. Hazel read the letter twice. She folded it carefully along its old creases. She placed it back inside the chest, on top of the harvest log, on top of the loose silver dollars she had begun to gather, into a small, careful pile on her knees. The gray February light was beginning to fade across the surface of the frozen lake. The white pines on the far shore had gone the color of slate. The raven was silent now. The wind had dropped. Hazel Whitaker sat on the loading ramp of the building her grandfather had locked in 1961, and she looked out over the frozen surface of Butternut Lake, and she finally understood what her grandfather had been teaching her. On a morning in January of 2008, when she had been 4 years old, and he had been 80 years old, and he had taken her out onto the ice. He had been teaching her to see what almost no one would see. He had been teaching her to read the difference between the surface that held and the surface that did not. He had been teaching her how to find the things people had hidden in the walls of their lives, because some of those things were meant to be found, and some of them were meant to be found by exactly her, and some of them had been waiting in the dark for 63 years. for a granddaughter who had not yet been born to come and stand in front of 3 planks of pine that did not match the wall around them. She said aloud to the empty ice house, to the frozen lake, to the white pines, to the raven somewhere in the trees, to the man who had been 33 years old in 1961, and who had stood on this same ramp and had wept in the cold. Thank you, grandfather. I will read it clearly. The light kept fading. The pines went black against the sky. Hazel did not move from the ramp. She did not yet know that the silver in her hand would be worth $8,200. She did not yet know that the harvest log she had set beside her would change the lives of the children of 3 families she had not yet met. She did not yet know that a 74-year-old retired carpenter named Rolf Mackin would drive his old blue Ford pickup down that unplowed lane in early May and would step out and would offer her, without asking for anything in return, the help of his hands and his years and his memory. She did not yet know that she would sleep in this building that night, alone by the light of a small fire, in the original brick hearth at the road end of the cold room, with the harvest log under her head and the canvas tool roll within reach of her hand. She did not yet know that this was the last night she would ever spend without a home. She knew only what her grandfather had taught her. Patience is the only tool that never breaks, and the surface that holds is always, always worth waiting for. She did not go back to Adelaide Lindgren's basement that night. She walked back through the knee-deep snow to the Forester, parked at the plowed turnaround. She drove south on County Road G to the small grocery store at the 4-way stop. She bought a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheddar cheese, a thermos of black coffee, 2 cans of beef stew, a box of matches, and a small bundle of dry kindling. She paid in cash. She drove back to the unplowed lane. She parked. She walked the half-mile back through the snow. The ice house was waiting for her. The loading doors were still cracked open the 3 feet she had pushed them. The chest was still on the ramp where she had left it, with the harvest log inside, and the silver inside, and the letter folded on top. She carried the chest into the building. She walked down the length of the cold room. At the road end, in the small room that had once been the ice master's office, she found what she had hoped to find: a brick hearth, original to the building, 1898. The chimney was sound. The flue was clear. The hearth had not been used in 63 years, and the soot inside had hardened to the consistency of slate. But the firebox was clean and the draw was good. She built a small fire from the kindling she had bought. She heated a can of beef stew in a saucepan she had carried in her tool roll for 3 winters at Pine Ridge. She unrolled a sleeping bag she had pulled from the back of the Forester. She laid it on the floor in front of the hearth. She set the harvest log under the rolled-up coat she would use as a pillow. She ate the stew slowly. She watched the fire. The fire threw moving light across the pine planking of the inner walls and across the open rafters above her head. The light reached the high beams that had been hand-hewn in 1898 from white pines that had been growing on this shore since the 1760s. The light reached the corners of the cold room and turned the dust to small, bright motes. The building was warm, not from the fire. The fire was small. The building was warm from the simple fact that it was inhabited. A building can be empty for 63 years and remain a building. The moment a person sleeps inside it, the building becomes a home. Hazel Whitaker, 21 years old, lay down on the timber floor in front of the small fire, with the canvas tool roll within reach of her hand, and the iron key on its leather thong around her neck, and the harvest log beneath her head. She slept without dreaming, and on the same floor where she slept, 63 years and 7 months before, on the night of March 8, 1961, a man named Gus Whitaker had sat at a small pine table with an oil lamp and a fountain pen, and had written a letter to the granddaughter he did not yet know he would have, and had sealed that letter with a small dark blob of pine pitch, and had carried it across the cold room to a hidden cavity behind 3 planks of pine that did not match the wall around them, and had laid it in a wooden chest beside a leather-bound book and a heavy canvas pouch, and had slid the panel back into place, and had stood for a long moment with his hand on the wood, and had said aloud to no one and to everyone, "I do not know who you will be, but I trust that you will come." The first month was the floor. The drainage floor of the cold room had rotted in 3 places along the lakeside end. 63 years of snowmelt had seeped under the loading doors during the spring thaws, had saturated the gravel drainage bed, had worked its way up into the timber planking, and had turned the wood in those 3 sections, the soft gray color that Gus Whitaker had taught his granddaughter when she was 4 years old to recognize as rotten ice, a surface that would not hold. Hazel pulled the rotted planks. She replaced the saturated gravel of the drainage bed. She drove 8 miles north to a small sawmill in Phelps called McKinley Lumber, where the McKinley family had been cutting white pine for Vilas County for 4 generations. The owner was a man in his 50s named Hollis McKinley. She told him what she needed. She told him why. She told him whose granddaughter she was. Hollis McKinley stood in the sawdust of his mill and looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Miss Whitaker, my great-grandfather sold the original cedar siding to the Butternut Lake Ice Company in 1898. My grandfather sold them the replacement roof timbers in 1922. My father sold them the last pallet of pine planking they ever bought in May of 1960-10, months before they closed. We will cut your planks for cost, no labor, no markup. You bring the truck and you tell me when." He did not say it warmly. He did not need to. The men of Phelps and Eagle River did not say things warmly. They said them clearly. The warmth was inside the clarity. She bought 11 planks of white pine, 8 feet long and 12 inches wide, milled from a single tree that had been cut on the McKinley land in 1990. The planks were dry. The planks were straight. The planks were pale and new and would look out of place beside the dark old timber of the surrounding floor. She knew from her grandfather's handbook that the new planks would darken within 2 winters. The cold room would do the work. The humidity would do the work. By the time she was 23 years old, the floor would look as if it had never been repaired. She laid the new planks herself. She used her grandfather's tools. She drove the heavy iron nails with a hand hammer. The way her grandfather and her great-grandfather had driven heavy iron nails for 127 combined winters. The floor was finished at the end of June. The man came on the first Saturday of May. She was kneeling on the new planks, driving a nail, when she heard the engine on the road. An old engine. A 6-cylinder Ford. Slow. Patient. The kind of engine that men of a certain generation in northern Wisconsin kept running for 40 years past the date the manufacturer had intended. She set down the hammer. She walked out onto the loading ramp. A blue Ford F-150 had stopped at the edge of the clearing. The truck was old. The paint had faded to the color of a robin's egg. The driver was older. He swung the door open carefully, the way men in their 70s swing doors carefully, and he climbed down from the cab with both hands on the door frame. He was a tall man, lean, white hair under a wool stormy chromer cap, a red and black plaid flannel shirt under a barn coat, work boots that had been resoled 3 times. He carried a folding chair in his right hand and a thermos in his left hand. He walked across the clearing through the wet grass of early May. He did not hurry. He did not call out. He walked the way men of his generation walk towards strangers in their 70s, with the slow, careful gravity of men who have nothing to prove and have not had anything to prove for a long time. He stopped at the foot of the loading ramp. He looked up at Hazel. He said, "My name is Rolf Mackin. My father was Reuben Mackin. My father was the second name on the last entry of the harvest log your grandfather kept in this building." Hazel said nothing. Rolf Mackin set down the folding chair. He opened it. He sat down on it carefully. He unscrewed the cap of the thermos. He poured black coffee into the inverted cap. He took a slow sip. He said, "My father came home on the evening of March 8th, 1961. I was 10 years old. I was sitting at the kitchen table doing my arithmetic. My mother was at the stove cooking pork chops. My father came through the door and he took off his boots in the mudroom. And he sat down at the table across from me and he did not say hello." Rolf Mackin took another sip of coffee. My mother put a plate of pork chops in front of him. He did not eat them. He poured himself a glass of whiskey. He drank it. He poured another. He drank it. He poured a third. He drank that one too. He poured a fourth. He sat there with the 4th glass in his hand, and he looked at me across the table and he said, "Reuben, today Wisconsin lost a piece of its soul." I did not understand him. I was 10 years old. I asked him what he meant. He said to me, "Today the last good thing your grandfather built died." Rolf Mackin paused. He said I should tell you, Miss Whitaker, my family was not one of the 4 founding families. The Mackins came to Vilas County in 1906. My grandfather started cutting ice with your great-grandfather Niels in 1930. We were hired hands. We were never partners. But for 3 generations of Mackin men, this building was the steadiest paycheck of the year. When your grandfather locked these doors, my father lost a piece of himself he never quite got back. That is why I'm here. Rolf Mackin set the cap of the thermos down on the loading ramp beside him. He looked up at Hazel Whitaker. "I am 74 years old," he said. "I have spent 64 years trying to understand what my father meant on that night. I am close to understanding. I am not all the way there yet." He paused. Then he said, "I came out here to sit on this ramp and watch you work. I will not charge you anything. I will not get in your way. I will sit in this chair and I will drink coffee and I will answer your questions when you ask them. And I will keep my mouth shut when you do not. May I do that?" Hazel Whitaker, 21 years old, looked down at the 74-year-old man in the folding chair at the foot of the loading ramp. She said, "Yes, Mr. Mackin, you may do that." She drove the silver into Rhinelander on a warm Tuesday in late May. The collector's shop was a narrow brick storefront on Brown Street, 3 blocks from the courthouse. The hand-painted sign above the door said, Berenson Coins and Antiquities. The window display held an old brass scale, a cigar box of Indian head pennies, a frame map of Vilas County from 1904. She pushed the door open. A small bell rang somewhere in the back of the shop. The man who came out from the back room was 68 years old. He wore a brown wool vest over a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. He had a jeweler's loop on a black cord around his neck and a pair of cotton gloves folded in his front pocket. His name was Howard Berenson. His grandfather had opened the shop in 1931. His father had run it from 1962 until 2007. Howard had run it for 18 years. Hazel set the canvas pouch on the glass counter. She said, 87 silver dollars. My grandfather hid them in a wall in 1961. They were inside a wooden chest, sealed inside a sawdust-insulated cavity for 63 years. I would like you to look at them. Howard Berenson did not say anything. He pulled the cotton gloves out of his pocket. He put them on. He loosened the waxed cord of the pouch. He poured the coins gently onto a black velvet pad on the counter. He turned on a small lamp. He bent his head over the coins. He put the loop to his eye. He did not speak for 22 minutes. He examined each coin individually. He set them in careful rows by date. 1898, 1904, 1921, 1925, 1932. He worked through the rows of Morgan dollars and through the rows of peace dollars and through the small handful of late silver dollars from the 1950s. When he was finished, he straightened up. He took the loop out of his eye. He folded the cotton gloves and set them on the counter. He said, Miss Whitaker, I have been a coin dealer for 40 years. My father was a coin dealer for 45 years. My grandfather was a coin dealer for 31 years. Among the three of us, we have appraised perhaps 11,000 collections of American silver. He paused. I have never seen a collection like this one. Not once. 87 coins. An unbroken date range of 62 years. Every coin in extremely fine condition or better. Every coin handled by only 1 or 2 people in its life. The story behind the collection adds nothing to the market value, but it adds everything to the historical value. The market value is $8,200. I will pay you $8,200 minus a 10% commission. Your share comes to $7,380. I will write the check today. Hazel looked at the 87 coins on the velvet pad. She said, I want to keep 4 of them. Howard Berenson said, Which 4? Hazel pointed. The 1898, she said. From the founding year. From Sven Olsen. The 1912. From the year Lars Bjork became ice master. The 1928. From the year my great-grandfather Niels became ice master. The 1946. From the year my grandfather Gus became ice master. Howard Berenson nodded slowly. He set those 4 coins aside into a small white envelope. He swept the remaining 83 coins into a leather sorting tray. He wrote out a check for $7,040, the adjusted amount, after the 4 coins were removed. He handed the check across the counter. He handed the small white envelope across the counter. Then he said, "Miss Whitaker, I want to tell you something." She waited. He said, "My grandfather opened this shop in 1931. The first customer who ever walked through that door was a man named Gus Whitaker. He was 3 years old. His father, Niels, had brought him to town to buy a wedding ring for Niels' second wife. My grandfather sold Niels Whitaker a gold band for $9.75. The receipt is in my filing cabinet in the back of this shop. I found it when I took over from my father in 2007. He paused. 3 generations of my family have done business with 3 generations of your family. I am not going to apologize for charging you a commission. A commission is how a business stays open. But I will tell you this. I have never in my life been more glad to write a check." Hazel folded the check carefully. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat. She picked up the small white envelope with the 4 coins. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Berenson." She walked out of the shop into the warm, late spring sunshine on Brown Street. She drove back to the ice house. She drove the speed limit the entire way. By the end of August, the apartment was finished. She had converted the road end portion of the cold room into a small, insulated living space. Not large, 18 feet by 20 feet. Big enough for one person and her tools and her books and her sleeping arrangements. A folding cot, a small, loupy wood stove that Rolf Mackin had helped her find at an estate sale in 3 Lakes and had helped her install in the north corner of the room with new triple-wall flue pipe running up through a carefully cut opening in the metal roof. A small 2-burner propane camp stove on a wooden countertop she had built from leftover pine planking. A composting toilet behind a partition wall she had framed and sheathed in 3 afternoons in July. A rainwater cistern outside the road end door fed by gutter pipe she had run along the eave of the metal roof. She had not touched the cold room itself. The cold room she had preserved exactly as she had found it. The drainage floor was sound now. The walls were sound. The rafters were sound. The double sawdust insulation continued to do what it had been engineered to do in 1898, which was to hold a deep mineral cold inside the building even in August. The harvest log lived in a small climate-controlled case she had built from reclaimed pine. The case had a glass front. The case sat on a wooden stand beside the entry door of the cold room. Anyone who walked into the building saw the harvest log first. Anyone who walked into the building saw the 4 silver dollars on a strip of leather hanging from a peg beside the case. Anyone who walked into the building understood within 30 seconds what kind of building it was and what kind of woman had restored it. Bryn Mackin came out to the building in the middle of September. Bryn was 28 years old. She was Rolf Mackin's eldest grandchild, the daughter of his daughter Carol, who had moved to Madison in 1990 and had raised Bryn between 2 worlds, the city and the Northwoods. 6 years earlier, when Bryn had been 22 years old and had been 1 year out of the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point, with a degree in environmental education, she had founded a small nonprofit called the Northwoods Heritage Foundation. The foundation ran educational programs for elementary and middle school students in 5 counties of northern Wisconsin. They taught the children about the logging history of the Northwoods, about the fur trade, about the railroads, about the ice trade, about the sawmills and the resorts and the fishing camps. and the way the working people of the pine country had made a living for 150 years on a land that did not give up its living easily. Bryn drove a battered green Toyota pickup. She had her grandfather's slow, patient eyes. She wore work boots and a barn coat that had clearly been her grandfather's barn coat before it had been hers. She walked up the loading ramp on a warm September afternoon. She stood in front of the open loading doors. She looked into the cold room. She saw the harvest log in its case. She saw the 4 silver dollars on their leather strip. She saw the long timber drainage floor and the open rafters in the deep, clean mineral cold of a building that had been engineered to hold winter inside itself. She turned to Hazel. She said, "Miss Whitaker, I would like to offer you a part-time job." Hazel listened. Bryn said, "The foundation needs a site interpreter at this building. We need someone who can talk to 4th graders and 8th graders and high school students about the ice trade of Vilas County. We need someone who can let them hold the tools. We need someone who can walk them down the loading ramp in January and February and show them the lake and teach them what the colors of the ice mean. We can pay you $22 an hour. We can offer 25 hours a week. We can guarantee year-round work. We will provide liability insurance for the building during the educational programs. The foundation will not own anything. The building remains yours. The harvest log remains yours. The decisions remain yours. We just want to bring children here. We want them to see what their great-grandfathers built." Hazel did not answer immediately. She walked the length of the cold room. She put her hand on the climate-controlled case that held the harvest log. She looked through the glass at the final entry her grandfather had written on the night of March 8th, 1961. Final harvest. 14-inch clear blue-black ice. 342 blocks cut. She turned back to Bryn Mackin. She said, "I would like that very much." Eleanor came out to the building in the middle of June in the 2nd year. Bryn Mackin drove her. Eleanor was 77 years old now. She walked with a walnut cane that had been carved for her by a former student of hers who had become a furniture maker in Hayward. The Toyota stopped at the plowed turnaround. Bryn helped Eleanor out of the cab. They walked slowly down the now graded gravel lane that Hazel had hired a contractor to lay in the previous October. The clearing opened up. The ice house stood in the morning sun. The cedar siding was the same weathered gray it had been in February of the previous year, but the loading doors were open and the building was breathing, and a small wooden sign on a cedar post by the loading ramp said, "Butternut Lake Ice House, 1898 to 1961, restored 2025. Northwoods Heritage Foundation Educational Site. Visitors welcome." Eleanor stopped at the foot of the loading ramp. She looked up at the building. She did not move for a long time. Then she said very softly, "My father walked away from this building on the 8th of March, 1961. He came home that night. He sat in the kitchen until 3 in the morning. My mother told me about it later. She did not know what he had done in the kitchen. She only knew that when he came up to bed at 3 in the morning, he was a quieter man than he had been when he had walked out of the kitchen at 7 in the evening." Eleanor took a careful breath. She said, "I always wondered what he had left behind." She walked slowly up the ramp. She walked into the cold room. She stopped in front of the climate-controlled case. She looked at the harvest log behind the glass. She looked at the final entry. She read it twice. Then she put her hand flat against the pine planking of the inner wall. The same inner wall her father had stood in front of on the night of March 8th, 1961. The same inner wall where 4 feet above the floor and 20 feet to the right of where Eleanor was standing now, 3 planks of pine ran at a slightly different angle than the planks around them. Father said Eleanor softly, "You old Swede." She turned to Hazel. She said he sealed it in the wall for 63 years, without a word to any of us. Why? Hazel had been waiting for this question for a year and a half. She had thought about it nearly every day. She had not arrived at a clean answer. She did not think there was a clean answer, but she had arrived at the answer she believed. She said, "I think he believed the log was not for the family. I think he believed it was for the person who would come back and continue the work. I think he could not be certain who that person would be. So he sealed it in the wall, and he trusted the wall to keep it dry, and he trusted time to bring the right person to it. The right person turned out to be me. I do not entirely know why it was me. I think it was because he taught me how to see when I was 4 years old on the surface of a frozen lake. I think he was patient. I think he had spent 15 winters on the ice, and he had learned patience the way other men learn impatience. And he was patient enough to leave the log in the wall, and to walk away and to never speak of it for 47 more years of his life. Eleanor did not say anything for a moment. Then she put her free hand, the one that was not on her cane, on Hazel's shoulder. She said, "He chose well." Wendell came in January of the 3rd year. He was 9 years old. He was small for his age. He was shy. He came on a Tuesday morning with his 4th grade class from Eagle River Elementary School. 21 children and their teacher, and 2 volunteer parents. The children bundled in snowsuits and mittens, their breath making white clouds in the cold air as they came up the gravel lane. The teacher was a woman in her 30s, whose name was Mrs. Ackerley. Mrs. Ackerley had brought her class to the ice house every January for the past 2 years. She and Hazel had developed a routine. The children filed up the loading ramp. They came into the cold room. They sat cross-legged on the heavy timber floor in a half circle in front of the climate-controlled case. Hazel told them the story. She told them about Sven Olsen and Lars Bjork and Niels Whitaker and Gus Whitaker. She told them about the 4 founding families in the 63 years of harvests. She told them about the way the cold room was engineered to hold winter inside itself. She told them about the sawdust in the double walls, and the drainage channels in the timber floor, and the iron loading doors that had been forged in Eagle River. In 1898, she passed her grandfather's small ice pick around the half circle. She let each child hold it. She watched their small hands close around the bone handle. She watched the small boy at the end of the half circle, the shy one, take the pick in his hands and stare at it for a long time before he passed it on. His name was Wendell. He had a careful, quiet face. He had pale gray eyes. When the story was finished, Hazel said, "Now we are going to go down to the lake. The lake is frozen. The ice is 14 inches thick today. I measured it this morning. 14-inch ice is strong ice, the same thickness my grandfather cut on the last harvest in 1961. I'm going to show you what the colors of the ice mean." The children put their mittens back on. They followed Hazel out of the cold room and down the loading ramp. The frozen lake stretched out below them. Snow had been blown off the ice in irregular patches by the wind. The exposed ice was dark. The covered ice was white. Hazel led them out onto the surface of the lake. She knelt down in the snow. She brushed an area of ice clear with her glove. The children gathered around her in a small, careful ring. Hazel said, "This is blue-black ice. This is clear ice. This is the strongest ice. This ice will hold a horse. This ice will hold a wagon. This ice will hold all of us and 20 more of us. This is the ice my grandfather looked for every winter for 15 winters." She moved a few feet to the side. She brushed snow off another patch. "This is white ice," she said. "White ice has air inside it. White ice is weak. White ice will hold a child, but it will not hold a wagon." She moved a few feet further. She brushed snow. "This is gray ice. Gray ice is rotten. Gray ice has water moving inside it. Gray ice will not hold anything. If you see gray ice, you walk around it." The children looked at the 3 patches of ice. Hazel said, "Now I am going to teach you the words my grandfather taught me when I was 4 years old. I want you to say them with me. Blue-black is strong. White is weak. Gray is rotten." The children chorused, "Blue-black is strong. White is weak. Gray is rotten." Hazel smiled. She said, "One more time. Blue-black is strong. White is weak. Gray is rotten." She looked at the small boy at the back of the ring. The shy one. "Wendell." She said, "Wendell, come here." He came forward carefully through the snow. Hazel reached behind her and unwrapped the wool blanket that was lying on the loading ramp. Inside the blanket was her grandfather's smallest ice saw. A practice saw, 18 inches long. The same saw Gus Whitaker had let her hold when she was 4 years old. She held the saw out to Wendell. She said, "Put your hands on the handle." Wendell put both his small hands on the wooden crossbar. Hazel knelt down in the snow beside him. She put her own hands around his hands. She said, "This saw is too big for you to pull. You are too small." "That is all right. You are not here to pull the saw. You are here to feel the handle. You are here to remember what your hands felt on a January morning when you were 9 years old. You are here so that when you are 21 years old, you will remember." Wendell did not say anything. He looked up at her with his pale gray eyes. He said, "My great-grandpa Reuben was in the harvest log. Grandpa Rolfe told me." Hazel said, "Yes, Wendell. He was. He was the second name on the last entry. He stood on this ice with my grandfather on the morning of March 8th, 1961, 64 years ago. They cut 342 blocks of ice together on that morning. They were the last men who ever did it." She paused. She said, "When you go home tonight, Wendell, I want you to tell your mother and your father that you stood on the same ice your great-grandfather stood on, and that you held the same kind of saw he held, and that you learned the same words he learned, and that you are going to remember them." Wendell nodded. His chin was steady. His eyes were steady. He had his great-grandfather's careful Northwoods face. He said, "Blue-black is strong, white is weak, gray is rotten." Hazel said yes. She let go of his hands. She stood up. She walked back to the loading ramp through the snow with the small saw in her arms. And the children of Eagle River Elementary School, following her in a careful single line. That was how Hazel Whitaker, 23 years old and home, taught a small, shy 9-year-old boy named Wendell Mackin Bjork the 3 sentences his great-grandfather had spent 40 winters of his life learning. And that was how the lesson carried from Sven Olsen in 1898 to Lars Bjork in 1912, to Niels Whitaker in 1928, to Gustav Whitaker in 1946, to Hazel Whitaker in 2008, to Wendell Mackin Bjork in 2027, passed safely across 5 generations of Vilas County, and went on living. And that was how the man who had stood on the loading ramp of the Butternut Lake Ice House on the afternoon of March 8th, 1961, and had wept in the cold finally received the answer he had been patient enough not to ask for. The answer was that the work had not ended. The answer was that the wall had held. The answer was that the granddaughter he had taught at 4 years old had come back at 21 years old. The work was going on. She sat on the loading ramp on a clear evening in late September. It was her 24th year. The sun was going down on the far side of the lake. The water was open. It would not freeze for another 2 months. The cooling autumn light had turned the lake the deep, cold blue that the lakes of the Northwoods turn at sunset in September when the summer is gone, and the birches along the shore are beginning to go gold, and the loons are gathering for their southern flight. A loon called somewhere out on the water. The cry crossed the surface and came back to her changed. Hazel Whitaker sat on the snow-stained timber of the loading ramp, and she thought about the people who had brought her to this moment. Her grandfather, Gus, who had taught her at 4 years old to read the colors of lake ice. Her mother, Maggie, who had died on a Sunday morning in March when Hazel was 7, and who had never known that her own father had sealed a harvest log and a canvas pouch of silver, and a folded letter into the wall of a building 8 miles from the house where she had grown up. Her Aunt Eleanor, who had taken in a 7-year-old girl in a borrowed black dress without hesitation, and who had read from an ice harvester's handbook on winter evenings for 14 years. Rolf Mackin, 76 years old now, who had spent 3 summers and 2 winters in a folding chair on the loading ramp, drinking coffee, answering questions when asked, keeping his mouth shut when not. Wendell, 9 years old, who would carry the 3 sentences forward into the rest of his life. She thought about the man who had stood on this ramp 66 years before her and had wept in the cold. She thought about all the things he had not known on that afternoon. He had not known that the cooperative would dissolve in 1962, and that the 4 founding families would let the building sit empty for 63 years. He had not known that the county would take possession in 1989. He had not known that the Historical Commission would delist the building in 2015. He had not known that the granddaughter he had taught at 4 years old would lose her mother at 7 and would be raised by his daughter Eleanor in the small white frame house on the edge of Eagle River. He had not known any of that, but he had trusted that the wall would hold. He had trusted that the cavity between the inner pine planking and the outer cedar siding packed with sawdust and lined with waxed canvas would protect a leather-bound book and a heavy canvas pouch, and a folded letter for as long as those things needed to be protected. He had trusted that someone would come. He had not known who. He had not known when. He had not asked for proof. He had spent 15 winters on the surface of a frozen lake with a saw in his hands, and he had learned to be patient with outcomes he could not control. And as Hazel sat there, in the deepening blue of late September, the lake quiet at her feet, she thought one last time of the man on the loading ramp in March of 1961. She did not see him with her eyes. She saw him with the part of her that had been taught when she was 4 years old, how to see what almost no one would see. She saw a 33-year-old man with frost on his beard and an iron key in his bare hand. She saw him hang the key on the padlock. She saw him pick up the canvas tool roll, and before he walked away, she saw him do one more thing. A thing no one had ever known he did. A thing his wife had not known, and his daughter had not known, and the bookkeeper had not known, and the men on the crew had not known. He turned to face the frozen lake. He looked out across the white surface that he had cut for 15 winters of his life. He did not raise his hand. He did not call out. He simply stood for one long, quiet moment, with the cold coming up off the ice into his bare face. And he said, in the careful, slow voice of a Swedish man, saying goodbye to a thing he had loved more than he had ever told anyone, "Farewell, old friend. I cut you for 15 years. You fed my family. I do not know if anyone will come back to you. But if anyone does, let them be patient. Let them be kind. Let them read you clearly." Then he turned, and he walked away into the gathering dusk of March 8th, 1961. Hazel Whitaker, 24 years old, sitting on the same loading ramp, 66 and a half years later, in the gathering dusk of a different season, said softly into the cooling air, "I am being patient, grandfather. I am being kind. I am reading you clearly." She got up. She walked back into the building. The cold room was dark. The loading doors stood open behind her, framing a rectangle of deepening blue sky. She walked the 80 feet of the timber floor in the gathering dusk. She walked past the climate-controlled case where the harvest log lived. She walked past the 4 silver dollars hanging on their leather strip from the peg beside the case. She walked into the small apartment at the road end where the wood stove was already warming the room for the night ahead. She closed the loading doors behind her. She closed them slowly. She closed them carefully. She closed them with the same patience her grandfather had used when he had closed them for the last time in his life, on the night of March 8th, 1961. But this time the closing was different. This time the closing was not the end of a thing. This time the closing was the end of one good day in the middle of a long life of good days. In a building that was no longer empty, on a lake that was no longer forgotten in a county, where the work of 4 founding families was being taught to the children of their great-grandchildren by a young woman who had bought a crumbling commercial ice house for $10 when she had nowhere else to go. It was the best $10 she ever spent. The wall holds. The work outlasts the worker, and the patience of a good man given freely to a small child on the surface of a frozen lake on a January morning in 2008 is never lost. It waits in the wood. It waits in the silver. It waits in the 4 sentences of a folded letter sealed with pine pitch. And on the cold gray afternoon when the right granddaughter finally kneels in front of the right wall, with the right pick in her hand, the patience comes home.